side event in the margins of the Convention on Conventional Weapons, on fully autonomous weapons, where the experts today are going to discuss, to make presentations on the issue why existing law, weapon reviews, and best practices are not enough to stand as a solution to the current challenges which are presented by fully autonomous weapon systems. Before I introduce our experts who are going to be making presentations today, I would want to start by mentioning that in the event that you may not be hearing some of the presentations clearly, it is usually better to use the earpiece. Also, I would like to say that after the presentations, the floor will be open for questions, comments on the presentations. So, myself, my name is Thompson Chengeta. I'm a member of the International Committee for Robots Arms Control, one of the founding members of the campaign to stop killer robots. Also a Zimbabwean from Zimbabwe, one of the countries supporting a preemptive ban on autonomous weapon systems. I'm also working with the South African National Chair for International Law. For the past years, I've been working with the former UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial killings, Professor Christopher Haynes, who made a presentation on the autonomous weapon systems in 2013, who also happened to have supervised my doctorate, which is also on the issue of autonomous weapon systems. However, today I will be just moderating the presentations from the lovely experts which we have today. I will start by introducing the first speaker, Ms. Bonnie Dockett, who is a senior lecturer at Harvard Law School and also a senior clinical instructor at the Harvard Law School Human Rights Clinic. Bonnie here has written or authored various papers and reports on autonomous weapon systems. The one which is, I want to specifically mention is the one in 2012, which in fact many have acknowledged to have sparked the debate on autonomous weapon systems within the United Nations Forum and across the globe. Bonnie, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Thompson, and thanks to all of you who are taking time out of lunch to come listen to our panel. And for those of you who heard the morning briefing yesterday, I apologize for taking the floor twice in a side event this week. As you all know, fully autonomous weapons raise a host of concerns. To name a few, they cross a moral threshold, they face difficulties complying with human rights and international humanitarian law, they would threaten international security. But today I want to focus on solutions rather than problems. Human Rights Watch and the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots are calling for an absolute ban on the development, production, and use of fully autonomous weapons. This ban should be laid out in a legally binding instrument, whether it be a protocol to the CCW or a standalone treaty. To help make the case for the ban, I will explain why 4 alternative approaches widely discussed this week will be insufficient. I'll address existing international humanitarian law, the regulation of use, weapons reviews, and the idea of requiring human control only at the design and deployment phase. A ban is the only solution that will address all of the dangers presented by fully autonomous weapons. So first, existing IHL. Some states have suggested they're relying on existing humanitarian law to deal with the concerns raised by fully autonomous weapons will be sufficient. IHL is, of course, an important underpinning of disarmament law, but a ban should be adopted to supplement and strengthen IHL. A ban would first of all clarify and standardize states' obligations, reducing the need for case-by-case determinations. This facilitates enforcement and in turn increases stigma, which can influence parties outside of a legally binding instrument. A new ban treaty could also cover more ground than existing IHL. In general, IHL focuses on the use of weapons, but a new instrument dedicated to fully autonomous weapons could also govern proliferation. It is important to keep such weapons out of irresponsible states parties, away from irresponsible states parties and non-state armed groups. Dictatorships, for example, could find them the perfect tool to repress their people, because they would have no fear that human troops would mutiny against committing war crimes. The international community has adopted several treaties dedicated to problematic weapons, many of which you were involved with, either negotiating or implementing them. A standalone treaty is especially appropriate in this case, given that fully autonomous weapons would revolutionize warfare in dangerous ways. A second proposed solution to the fully autonomous weapon problem is to regulate them. Regulations could restrict their use to isolated areas, such as deserts or under the water, but regulation would not be as effective as an absolute ban. Like reliance on existing IHL, regulations would make development of fully autonomous weapons lawful. Doing so could lead to an arms race. In addition, if fully autonomous weapons came into existence, they could proliferate, as I already mentioned. Past experience also shows that limiting weapons to specific targets is often a failed experiment. Once weapons are in an arsenal, even responsible states may be tempted to use them. Some states, for example, argue that cluster munitions were acceptable if they were used on isolated targets, such as a tank in the desert. But as you know, they are widely used in urban areas, including in Iraq and Lebanon. The shortcomings of regulation are even more serious if they come in the form of a non-binding best practices. A legally binding prohibition maximizes protection because it is more comprehensive, easier to enforce, and increases stigma. Third, the third way to address fully autonomous weapons, which has been mentioned frequently this week, is to rely on weapons review processes. Weapons reviews assess the legality of future use of a new weapon during its design, development, and acquisition phases. It's often referred to in Article 36 reviews because they are required under Article 36 of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions. Those who support relying on weapons reviews argue that a problematic autonomous weapon would fail a review before it is even produced. Weapons reviews are certainly important tools, but they have many shortcomings. Weapons reviews are not universal. Not all states are party to Additional Protocol 1, and it is debated whether they are required under customary law. And currently, there are only fewer than 30 states are known to have national review processes. Leaving reviews up to individual states can also lead to inconsistent results. Lack of transparency interferes with monitoring, and without monitoring, states have less incentive to conduct rigorous reviews. Finally, weapons reviews would be limited in scope, and they would not adequately take into account the use of weapons outside of armed conflict, such as in law enforcement situations, or the ethical or human rights implications in any context. While strengthening weapons review is a good goal, CCW states should not let it distract from the urgent matter at hand, that is, addressing the dangers of fully autonomous weapons. Finally, while most states in this room agree human control over the use of force is essential, some contend control at the design and deployment phases would be sufficient. If control is confined to that stage, unpredictability would be almost impossible to avoid, and thus control would not be meaningful. The absence of meaningful control over the selection and engagement of targets would lead to several dangers. It would make compliance with international humanitarian law and international human rights law very difficult. Compliance with international law requires the application of human judgment to decisions about the use of force in specific cases. Lack of meaningful control would also create an accountability gap. It would be unfair and legally difficult to hold commanders, programmers, manufacturers legally liable for the unpredictable actions of the machine. It would also cross a moral threshold not to have human control. Fully autonomous weapons would find it challenging to follow pre-programmed ethical frameworks in unforeseeable situations, and thus humans would be ceding control over life and death decisions. To be meaningful and effective, and to avert these dangers, human control should be exerted over individual attacks, not merely at the design and deployment stage of the weapon. And I would note that such a requirement is the same as a ban on the use of fully autonomous weapons, i.e. weapons that select and engage targets without meaningful human control over individual attacks. Of all the alternatives on the table, only a preemptive ban would effectively address all the concerns about fully autonomous weapons raised at CCW this week. It would promote compliance with IHL and human rights law, prevent development, proliferation in an arms race, avoid creating an accountability gap, and preserve human control over life and death decisions. So I'd be happy to answer more questions, and I also want to, Thompson said there's a new report out that's still available at the side of the room that addresses these issues and many others, including the dangers of fully autonomous weapons and other reasons why a ban would be timely and effective. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The copies are finished. It's also available online. I will take this opportunity to rush to introduce Ms. Maya Braham, who is from the Geneva Academy of International and Humanitarian Law, where she's a researcher in weapons law, and also she's led research project at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, and also has worked as a protection delegate for the International Committee for Red Cross, and has consulted with a number of NGOs, including NGO Article 6, which is also one of the members of the campaign to stop killer robots. Ms. Graham,
Thank you very much, Thompson, and thank you to the campaign to stop killer robots for inviting me today to present some of the findings of a study that I just completed and which will be published early next year at the Geneva Academy, and which examines the legality of autonomous weapon systems from an international human rights law perspective, including in situations of armed conflict. So the study touches on a range of issues, but in keeping with the topic of this side event, I will focus on two types of challenges raised by increasing autonomy in weapon systems to the compliance with international norms for the protection of the human person, and that, in my view, point to the need for additional explicit legal restrictions or requirements to ensure that human agents retain meaningful human control over the use of force. The first challenge relates to the deferral of human intervention or the diffusion of human control in the use of force, and which affects the applicable law. And the second one relates to the legal requirements, the legal requirement not only to refrain from arbitrary killings, but also to account for how and why people are targeted or killed. And the scenario that forms the backdrop to much of the discussion in the study is that of the use of autonomous weapon systems to secure perimeters or boundaries or even international borders, so-called sentry or patrol autonomous systems. Such systems in the imaginaries of proponents are often portrayed as a priori unproblematic, among other reasons because they assume that these zones would be free of objects, including human body-shaped objects, that cannot legally be made the target of an attack. And what I find intriguing in these imaginaries is that they reflect an assumption that the killing in these situations would be governed by IHL, humanitarian law, that is, that the weapon systems would be used as means of warfare in the conduct of hostilities. And I was struck by parallels in the rhetorics of proponents to other situations of automated killing, or so-called kill zones, that we know from the past. And here I have put in an illustration of the kill zone at the inner German border during the Cold War, which contained mines, anti-personnel mines, and what they called other automatic systems, but which turned out to be mines later on. But what's interesting here is the justifications by people who were involved in the maintenance of these systems are very similar to what we hear today by proponents of sentry systems. And specifically the inner German border situation has been examined by different human rights bodies, and they have all found this regime to be in flagrant violation of international human rights law. So the first challenge that I would like to address today is I would like to problematize this presupposition that autonomous sentry systems killing by means of such systems would be governed by the rules on the conduct of hostilities, and perhaps just schematically we can distinguish between a law enforcement paradigm and the conduct of hostilities paradigm. I don't expect you to read all this, but I think what's important to retain from the rules that apply to law enforcement, including during armed conflict, is that it leaves, in my view, no scope for categorical targeting, whereas there is limited scope for categorical or so-called status-based targeting in a conduct of hostilities framework. Now, in present-day armed violence situations, it is often contested whether the use of force should be assessed against a law enforcement or a conduct of hostilities framework. And we can easily imagine that a Sentry autonomous weapon system could encounter both situations, including if it is deployed along an international border, for instance. So that even during armed conflicts, for the use of force to be governed by the law on hostilities, it has to be designed or intended to serve the military goal of a party to the armed conflict. It's what we often call, there must be a belligerent nexus. And in some situations, this belligerent nexus cannot be presumed. For instance, if the autonomous weapon system was not initially activated by a human agent with the conduct of hostilities in mind, or if a party to an armed conflict does not in fact exercise sufficient control over the system to use it as a means of warfare against another party to the conflict. And so in these cases, the use of force would remain governed by the default paradigm, which is the law enforcement paradigm, which leaves, in my mind, no room for categorical targeting. And then furthermore, even if an autonomous sentry system was activated by a human agent during an armed conflict, with the intent to conduct hostilities in mind, we could imagine a scenario of a system deployed to secure the perimeter around a military forward base in an area of active hostilities. That even in these situations, specific force applications would need to proceed according to the law enforcement model in situations where the user state, by means of the system or otherwise, it exercises control over the circumstances that allows for a differentiated use of force. So that means that human control over autonomous systems, even during the conduct of hostilities, must safeguard the opportunity to shift to a law enforcement model when this becomes factually possible and therefore legally required. Now, the second challenge that I would like to mention relates to the legal requirements and limitations on why and how people are made the target of security measures, including the use of force, or are killed. So from an international human rights law perspective, the manner in which decisions are made to identify targets are relevant to the legality of resulting deaths. So for various reasons, targeting based on algorithmic processes threaten human dignity and the enjoyment of a range of freedoms and rights. So that whilst deaths resulting from lawful acts of war, in the conduct of hostilities in compliance with IHL, for instance, are not arbitrary deprivations of life, to comply with the obligations of a state under the right to life, when individuals have been killed as a result of the use of force, there must be some form of effective investigation. So the legal prohibition of arbitrary killing by state agents would be ineffective in practice if there is no procedure for reviewing the lawfulness of the use of force. And to be effective, an investigation must be capable of leading to a determination of whether the use of force was justifiable in specific circumstances, and to the identification and punishment of those responsible. So that's not an obligation of result, but it must be capable to produce these results. And this procedural positive obligation under the right to life continues to apply in the context of armed conflicts, including in relation to the conduct of hostilities. So, Consequently, even in the conduct of hostilities, it is essential that human agents remain involved in algorithmic targeting processes in a manner that enables them to explain the reasoning underlying decisions in concrete circumstances. I think this is essential to ensuring the availability of an effective remedy and accountability for the use of force, and to maintain public confidence in states' adherence to the rule of law. Putting in place a system that makes this a priori impossible cannot be in conformity with the right to life. So in conclusion, I think that autonomous weapon systems, like other new technologies and evolving security practices, challenge the categories and disrupt the human-machine configurations around which legal norms governing the use of force have been articulated. And this generates significant controversies and uncertainties about the applicability and the meaning of existing norms, which diminishes the law's capacity to serve as a guidepost. Also in debates on autonomous weapon systems that center on international humanitarian law, legal requirements and limitations pertaining to how and why people are killed have received, in my mind, insufficient attention. And I think there is a risk that by accommodating violent practices based on algorithmic processes within existing IHL, that by doing so, the norms are preserved formally, but they are filled with radically different meaning, inconsistent with the duty to safeguard life and with elementary respect for human dignity. And that is why, to my mind, there is a need for additional explicit legal norms to ensure that the exercise of human control in the use of force remains meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maya, for your presentation. And also, without wasting any time, I would want to introduce to you Peter Heby here. Peter is many years of experience in disarmament or weapon regulation. He's coming from the Norwegian Red Cross. As far as back as 1983, he was already directing the disarmament program within the United Nations office, way before I was even born. Peter here, before joining the Norwegian Red Cross, he was head of the arms unity in the legal division of the International Committee of the Red Cross, and he's also led, discussions on behalf of the ICRC in the negotiation of many protocols to the CCW, which have been mentioned throughout this week. In particular, the three protocols to the CCW: the Mine Ban Treaty, Convention on Cluster Munitions, and the Arms Trade Treaty. Peter, we are so honored to have you here, and you're welcome to the presentation.
Thank you very much, Thompson. You make me feel very old.
And special.
Thank you.
Experience.
So I'm affiliated, most of my work now is with the Norwegian Red Cross, but my comments are really, as Peter Heby, with all these various experiences, and also I have to credit a lot of my insight on this particular issue to the work I did with the UNIDIR study in 2014, was it? Yes, 14. The various working papers and expert groups where Kirsten taught me everything I need to know about autonomous weapons. But again, I'm not speaking for UNIDIR. I really, the starting point that I have is that law and weapon reviews are one essential element, but are completely inadequate as a framework for analyzing the acceptability and desirability of all issues related to fully autonomous weapons. And even if we take as a starting point that autonomous weapons could respect IHL rules on discrimination and proportionality, which has not been demonstrated, there are a host of other issues that arise and must be addressed in establishing any responsible public policies. And so I'm going to identify a number of other issues that I believe are relevant, that go beyond weapon reviews, beyond IHL, and which I think urgently must be addressed. I think one first issue which has been referred to is ethics. The law only inadequately reflects ethics. The law is developed on the basis of negotiations, compromise, and what is possible at any given moment. So, although law may be based in ethics, some law, it is not the limit of the ethical debate. In addition, I think it's fair to say that all existing law and international law was drafted based on the assumption that it's regulating the behavior of human actors who have a certain forms of judgment and of emotion in their behavior. If that's not the case, we're talking about a different framework of legal regulation entirely. Another element that is probably crucial and that won't be resolved through a legal analysis is the question of, does killing by autonomous machines violate the basic principle of human dignity, which is a core of human rights law? And it's certainly not something that's normally considered in weapon reviews. In Christoph Heinz' 2013 Special Rapporteur's report, he highlighted that a human must make a decision on the responsibility to initiate lethal force, and that to delegate this to machines and precluding human deliberation, even if it were feasible, dehumanizes warfare even further. Machines, as we know, lack both morality and mortality. One of Heinz's most important conclusions was that human dignity is an overriding consideration, even were lethal autonomous weapons able to fully respect the rules of IHL and only target combatants. He concludes that if they are deemed not to respect human dignity, quote, no other consideration can justify the deployment of lethal autonomous systems, no matter the level of technical competence at which they operate. So human dignity and the taking of life with no human intent to do so raises many questions in relation to this aspect of which is both ethical and based in human rights law. One of the things that came out in the UNIDIR meetings was also that human emotion has been shown empirically to be an essential element of good decision-making. Behavioral studies that were presented involving people devoid of emotion due to traumatic brain injuries showed that such persons have difficulty in making good decisions and adjusting their thinking based on new circumstances. So the emotional element of human decision-making is relevant to getting good results. Another element that will not easily be dealt with in a legal-based approach is accidents. We've seen the new UNIDIR report, which presents in great depth the complexity, the likelihood, and the unpredictable nature of complex systems and accidents which they will cause, of unforeseen event, the interaction behind the scenes of various complex systems, which is known to be hard to predict and will create results that may be quite unexpected. So, given that light, that fact alone, how in the world will an Article 36 or any other legal review take that into account? How can you review things that are unpredictable? If you can't reach conclusions, or the conclusion must be to exclude that option. Probably of fundamental importance as well, and again, not a legal consideration, is the implications for the future of warfare and for the legitimacy of military operations and the role of armed forces within human societies. As is obvious, the deployment of fully autonomous weapon systems has the potential to fundamentally change the nature of warfare. There are issues that arise when projecting this into the future that have, for example, the question of proliferation. Not only the proliferation of users, but the proliferation of producers. In relation to the proliferations of users, one must expect that these systems will be used against you. In the case of blinding laser weapons, where we had engagement with Human Rights Watch of US authorities, the assumption when they were being promoted and developed was that they will be in responsible hands, they will be in your hands. Well, there was a rude awakening when it was seen that a number of other countries were moving in this direction, that a Chinese company was beginning to market blinding lasers in arms bazaars in the Middle East and South Asia, and that in fact these would be used against your forces rather soon if they weren't stopped. In relation to the proliferation of producers, yes, when we discuss things here, the assumption is the top quality, the perfect system that will have gone through very careful scrutiny, quality control, and despite the likelihood of accidents pointed out in the Unidir report, it's assumed that things will work well. Well, that's fine, maybe, or maybe not, when you have a few producers. But you can be sure that once a few producers go into this market, there will be a large number of others who will quickly follow. And you can also, as has happened with other military technologies, predict that the quality will begin to vary. It won't be the top state of the art. It'll be whatever can be produced in various markets. So proliferation of producers has its own costs or risks that go beyond a normal legal review. Other issues relating to the nature of warfare, speeding up yet further the speed of warfare. Is that something that is desirable? Accidental wars. One of the things that was brought into the Unidir meeting was the deployment of systems which didn't know that a conflict had ended and continued to fight, or a system which was activated unintentionally or fired unintentionally and started a conflict. There is a potential for inadvertent or accidental wars through the deployment of such systems. Another issue beyond legal reviews is lowering the threshold for conflict because of creating a lower risk to the users. That leads to a number of other issues to do with asymmetric warfare and its implications. Basically, the deployment of such systems at a distance, which is somewhat the case already now with remotely controlled weapon systems, is on invulnerability and its consequences. Throughout the history of warfare, every attempt to create invulnerability has triggered a response. No one wants to accept invulnerability of the others. This was demonstrated through the Maginot Line before World War II, the Star Wars Defense Shield effort, the kamikaze bombers in World War II, which were in part a response to the speed and altitude at which Allied forces were able to fly and Japanese forces were not able to fly. It's also part of the phenomena of suicide bombers and some forms of terrorism. So invulnerability has a price. It has a likely predictable response. Probably the best quote I've seen on this comes from U.S. Marine Lieutenant Brendan Mills, writing in Foreign Affairs. He says, "In the age of cyber attacks and terrorism, we need to look for policies that seek to further insulate our non-combatants, rather than to serve them up as the only viable targets for our enemies to attack. My friends and I signed up so that our enemies will fight us instead of our families. And I worry that if humans don't fight wars, we'll have more wars, and our families will be the enemy's primary targets." In other terms, it's worth reflecting on the fact that since ancient times, armed forces and fighters have been accorded privileged roles in society, in part due to the extraordinary level of courage expected of them. If this is eroded and armed violence becomes a technical occupation exercised at a distance, how will this affect the legitimacy and acceptance of military operations? So to sum up, autonomous weapons and invulnerability carry risks of engendering instability for all instead of security. I think from what I've said, it's clear that there are fundamental issues involved that go far beyond the scope of IHL and Article 36.